That's the actual bill, so I'm eager to sign it. And though I don't know, I guess we don't have to persuade anyone anymore. We're here in the spirit that defines this moment, and that's the spirit of remarkable unity. I think there's an old African proverb, some of you have heard, said, if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. I could not be more grateful, more proud of the courage on display by each and every person you see up here, by the speaker and the pro tem that set the conditions that allowed this process to unfold over the course of the last few months. I cannot be more proud of the hard work of the two groups that were assembled in the Assembly and the Senate that day in, day out, consistent basis, every week strengthened this effort and made it 10x better than when we started. None of this was possible unless you were all willing to stand up and stand tall and have the courage of your convictions to truly represent 40 million Californians that were in desperate need to understand why. Why is it that we're paying at peak $2.61 more per gallon of gasoline than the national average? What is it in this state, year after year, that defines the terms of the gap that we pay that's unique in this nation? When you consider all the fees, all the unique environmental blends, there was still no justification coming from the oil companies. That mystery surcharge remains a mystery to this day. But finally, we have the ability now to get into that black box and put the light of day to begin to understand this web of complexity on the spot markets, the refineries, the relationships to the gas stations, global, not just domestic supply. Finally, we're in a position to look our constituents in the eye and say, we now have a better understanding of why you're being taken advantage of. Poor people, hardworking folks out there with 1980 old beaten down cars, driving 1-2 hours a day to work. Folks out there in rural parts of California just struggling to make ends meet. $2.61 more per gallon, $6.42. That was in the aggregate. Folks down in LA, it's up to $9 for gasoline at the time when crude oil prices were dropping. And there were no increases in taxes, no increases in fees in the state of California. And you saw these folks spinning around 30-plus lobbyists working on their talking points from Friday to Monday, spinning to try to figure this out. But none more audacious than the committee you guys had yesterday, where one of the big oil, whatever these folks are, these paid folks, where it was simply asked, I think Senator Ting asked simple questions, and once again, why the big problem? What's the delta? They said, well, they laid it out. I guess they worked on this all weekend. They laid it out, and they said, well, just not a lot of competition. There's not a lot of competition, which is another way of saying, because we can screw you, because we chose to screw you. And that's exactly the point. These folks don't have your back. They don't care about you. What did Chevron do, just one of the big oil companies? They took $75 billion of this windfall and all the international market disruptions. They didn't invest it back to offset the burdens on working folks. They put it in their back pocket. $75 billion of stock buybacks and dividends increases. I mean, you saw some of these oil companies in a 90-day period, forget the annual profits, in a 90-day period, net profit, $63 billion. They don't have your back. So I want to thank each and every member of the legislature for having the backs of 40 million Americans that live in the greatest state in our union. I want to thank you for not backing away from this fight. I want to thank you for your power of emulation, because we proved we could actually beat big oil. I know there was a guy down there in the South, in a state I think called Florida, who, was sitting there, and he used this phrase. He said, there's a new sheriff in town, when he brought Mickey Mouse to his knees. Well, there's a new sheriff in town in California where we brought big oil to their knees. And I'm proud of this state, and I'm proud of this state of this legislature and their courage and convictions. So this is a big deal. That said, I'll close with humility that we got now a lot of work to do. We're setting up an oversight division at our CEC. We got to hire the right folks. We got to make sure the advisory committee is doing its job. We got to make sure we do justice to what we're promoting. We don't want to overpromise. Nothing's going to happen in the short term. Gas prices aren't going to drop immediately. We're finally getting the information. As I said to many members standing behind me, what improved this process and ultimately the product that I'll sign is it truly is ready, aim, fire, not ready, fire, aim. We seek to truly understand what has been impossible to understand in the past. And then we will go through a rule-making process, a very public process, before we pull any triggers, mindful of unintended consequences, mindful of who we are up against. If you think for a second big oil is going to roll over this moment, think again. None of us are naive of what's coming next. So we'll maintain our vigilance. We're mindful of what we're moving towards, and we're mindful of our responsibility. And these are the final words. We did this, and I hope folks paid attention, with a cadence of some consideration that society becomes how we behave. None of us are naive. 90% of us will drive home, having filled up our tank of gas. Many of us will be flying back Thursday to our home districts in airplanes fueled by this industry. In an economy that's one of the strongest economies in the world. In a state that has the third largest refinery capacity in any state in the world. It's not that we dismiss oil. As all consumers, we have to be mindful that we are our behaviors. But I'm proud of this state that we laid out a marker years and years ago. It's interesting. It was laid out here in 1967 when a young man was sworn in by the name of Ronald Reagan in this rotunda right here. And when they established the Air Resources Board that gave California the ability to regulate tailpipe emissions, to address the health impacts of oil and fossil fuels. A guy named Richard Nixon that codified that in the Clean Air Act in 1970. I joke all the time, Republicans should look these two folks up. Learn about Nixon and Reagan. As it relates to the rules that were established that allowed us to do things few other states are able to do. And we did that in the context of the work we're doing on zero-emission vehicles. And I hope you all continue to remind yourselves of the progress you're making in that space. $8.9 billion you included in the budget to advance that transition. Over 80,000 charging stations now up and operational in this state. Billions of dollars more to do more in low-income communities. More subsidies here than any other state to stack those subsidies for low-income communities. And we had 22.7% of all cars sold, almost a quarter of the cars sold in California in Q4 last year are electric vehicles. We want to dominate the future. 6 times more clean energy jobs in this state than fossil fuel jobs. We want to dominate the future, and we want to do it justly. And we want to make sure that transition leaves no one behind. And I want to just reinforce this point. One of the things I'm most proud of this legislation, they demanded more accountability in that transition to labor, to communities that will be disproportionately impacted by this transition in Kern County and other parts of our state. And we have a responsibility to follow through in terms of meeting the needs of those communities and those that will be impacted by this transition. And that is laid out prescriptively in this legislation as well, a responsibility to do that truly, justly, and to make sure we put real meat on those efforts. It's not just a rhetorical exercise. So across the spectrum, demand and supply, a strategy, a plan, a regulatory process of inclusivity and transparency, a framework of focus on dealing with unintended consequences, a responsible approach, but at a scale no jurisdiction has ever advanced anywhere that we know of, anywhere else on the globe. Thank you, Jamie. What you did, what so many of the environmental justice organizations did, what labor did, to business leaders that had the courage to say, wait a second, we're being screwed here as well. That had the courage to stand up, not the ones whose members of the board are members of WISPA that couldn't stand up because they didn't have your back or businesses' back, but those business groups that did. I want to thank that coalition because you helped create the conditions and set the expectations. You demanded more of us, and you gave us that room to exercise leadership that we're exercising here today. California, thank you. Thank you to the people of the state of California. You should not have had to endure these price spikes. You should not have to endure them in the future. We are going to get under the hood, and we are going to address this issue like no other jurisdiction has in this country. I'm proud of these guys, proud of all of you, and I look forward now to signing this bill and making it law.